And what I wanted to do was spend some time talking to you today about how we use journalism to cover the Arab Spring in ways that we weren't able to do just a few years ago. So, in late 2010, we had been using Twitter in all sorts of typical journalistic ways, fact-checking presidential debates, asking for tips from people online, pretty standard stuff. But then, that December, I started seeing tweets from some Tunisian bloggers that I had met a number of years earlier. Some were in Tunisia, others were outside of the country because they'd been forced out of the country. And they started using this hashtag, Sidi Bouzid. And it turns out Sidi Bouzid was the name of a town in central Tunisia where a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi had set himself on fire because the police confiscated his produce cart because he refused to pay a bribe. He ended up passing away several weeks later from the injuries he sustained. But what happened in the hours after that was rather unusual because people started showing up in the streets of Sidi Bouzid demanding to know why this happened. And some of them had camera phones. And they uploaded this footage to Facebook and YouTube and elsewhere. And as the days went by, these videos started to circulate further, causing more people to start wanting to make protests in other cities. And initially, these protests were about economic justice and the like, but it soon became very apparent that these protesters were quite disenchanted, and something big was going to happen. I recall that December 28th, I tweeted out, "Following protests in Tunisia via Sidi Bouzid hashtag. Wonder what the chances of all this leading to a Jasmine Revolution? Don't know." Now, I called it the Jasmine Revolution because, of course, every revolution needs a color or a flower named after it. And if you ever spend time in Tunisia, you'll see men walking down the Corniche with jasmines in their hair. And so, when I asked that question, it was kind of rhetorical, but no one besides the Tunisians replied to me because basically no one else in the West really knew what was going on. A couple of news outlets had covered it, but for the most part, it was being ignored. It was the holiday season. There were other things to cover. But nonetheless, I became really interested in what I was seeing. The only problem is I don't speak Arabic, and I definitely don't speak Tunisian Arabic, which is a very specific dialect. And so when I started seeing photos and videos that had Tunisian Arabic in it, I was kind of stumped because I couldn't just go to Google Translate, for example, and try to figure out what was going on. And I knew one guy on Twitter who spoke Arabic in a number of dialects, so I decided to message him and ask him if he could translate this particular picture for me. And this was from a protest, and I knew this wasn't blood, that this was paint smeared on it, so it was intended to get people's attention, but I had no idea what it said. And within a couple minutes, I actually heard from someone else, a guy who goes by Rafik on Twitter, and he explained to me it was actually the name of a young man who had been killed in one of the protests the day before. And so what I noticed at that moment is even though I was trying to have a one-on-one at-reply conversation with this one dude I knew, others were paying attention to what we were talking about, and they started offering their expertise as well. And so as the days and weeks went by, I found more and more people sharing information with me so I could get a better handle of what was happening on the ground in Tunisia. At one point, people were even using Twitter and Facebook to identify snipers' nests. And so this is a tweet that comes from the city of Gafsa. Someone had spotted a sniper's nest on top of several buildings, and they got the word out through social media. So the protest march that was just about to start ended up weaving around in a different direction, avoiding casualties. And so it suddenly just exploded with a number of protesters, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Tunisia, in the streets of Tunis, until eventually, 4 weeks to the day after Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, the president of Tunisia was forced to flee. And there was a lot of celebration online by the Tunisians, not surprisingly. And one of the things I saw that day was a tweet from a Tunisian, one of the bloggers that I had met about 5 years earlier. And he said, "Okay, Arabs, you've seen how it's done in Tunisia. Tag, you're it." And I thought that was really interesting because up until then I was just focusing very myopically on Twitter, but clearly the rest of the Arab world was paying attention. And so as the days passed, I started going into my email calendar and just blocking off random hours and random days for the next month or so, just in case this picked up anywhere else. And within a week, we knew what was going to happen next. We didn't know how, but we knew something was going to happen. And it was about this guy. This was, of course, the revolution in Egypt. People started to spread the word that on January 25th, which was National Police Day in Egypt, they were going to organize a major protest. And they didn't know where it would go from there, but they were hoping it would somehow catalyze a much larger series of protests around the country. And I wanted to be able to cover this, but I only knew one Egyptian at the time that was involved in the activism movement there. And it's this guy, Alaa Abdel Fattah. And you know, unlike some people you meet on Twitter, I knew he existed. I've met him in person. I'd seen him speak before. And so he wasn't even in Egypt at the time, but he was living in exile at that moment. But I knew he had a lot of connections in the country. So he seemed like a good person I'd want to pay attention to on Twitter. So what I ended up doing is I clicked that little button that shows that he was following 960 people. And I went all the way down to the bottom of it. Because if you scroll down a list of people that you follow on Twitter, it's in reverse chronological order. So when you get to that very bottom, you see the people he followed first several years before that. And I figured none of these people seem to be celebrities, so he must have followed them because he knew them in real life. And so I followed a number of them and did the same thing on their Twitter list, their Twitter following list, and I started monitoring the conversations among them to see if I could figure out who's connected to whom. And I noticed a lot of things very quickly. So for example, this was a tweet by a woman named Manam, and she references Alaa. Apparently he had been briefly held at one point, and so she was commenting on his situation. And she heard it from his mother. And then I saw another tweet that she said specifically, Layla Suwaif, my mother-in-law, is on Al Jazeera right now. Later, Alaa tweeted something talking about Layla Suwaif and referenced that it was his mom. So putting two and two together, it became pretty clear that, as it turns out, Manal and Alaa are married to each other. I didn't know that before the revolution began. And so, by paying attention to the relationships and the way people were talking, what they said when they at-replied each other, how they retweeted each other, whether they swore at each other in a playful way, all of these things gave you a sense of how they were connected. And so by the time the revolution kicked into high gear, I was following dozens and dozens of people who were actively working in Tahrir Square to protest against the government. Now, after the 18 days of the revolution, a sociologist decided to take a look at all of this Twitter data to see how these Egyptian protesters were connected to each other on Twitter. And he came up with this map. And it's just so you can understand what's going on here. On the blue side were Egyptians who were tweeting in English. On the right side were Egyptians tweeting in Arabic. And the purplish ones were using a combination of English and Arabic at different times. And the first thing I noticed when I saw this map is I actually thought this guy had taken my Twitter list. I had basically replicated a social network of activists simply by following the paper trail that they had left behind on Twitter. And it turned out to be very accurate and captured the perspective of who ended up turning out to be some of the leaders of the revolution there. And as it was happening, it was incredible because one after another, people would be reporting from all over Tahrir Square. On one day, I tweeted more than 1,400 times, retweeting what became known as the Battle of the Camel, when for almost 24 hours, they were sieged in Tahrir Square by a group of thugs. And dozens and dozens of people on the ground used Twitter to relay what was happening. And as I watched this unfurl, first in the daytime and then into the wee hours of the morning East Coast time, I realized what was going on here was a form of situational awareness. That because I was actually able to sit back several thousand miles away and watch this network of people tweeting about what's happening in different locations and how they're interacting with each other, I had a much better sense of what was going on across the entire field of battle, if you will, than any individual on the ground did. Because when you're there, you only see what's happening immediately around you. And when people are throwing Molotov cocktails and are shooting tear gas at you, it's even harder to know what's going on. But Twitter somehow gave me this chance to figure it out in a whole new way. So At that point, I basically dropped what was really my day job at NPR and spent the next 18 months doing nothing but experimenting with social media to cover what was happening in all of these countries. And it just spread from one to another and another and another and another. People started using hashtags so people could RSVP for when these protests were going to happen. And you just didn't know where it was going to go next. I then started spending a lot of time specifically trying to cover Libya, because before the revolution started there weren't any journalists in the country. There were very few Western journalists who had even been to Libya. And so from a reporting perspective, it was basically a black hole. So I wanted to figure out new ways of using social media to track down people there, find out what's going on, and try to piece the stories together. And so about a month or so into the revolution, I got a tweet from someone asking me to look at a video. And of course, it was in Libyan Arabic, as best I could tell. I didn't speak Libyan Arabic, but nonetheless, people came out of the woodwork and they'd listen to it, and they'd say, okay, well, I'm from Egypt, and I recognize the accents from the eastern parts of the country, so that's probably Benghazi. Then someone else would come out of the woodwork and say, if you look at that video, there's a particular building that looks Italian and it's on the waterfront. That's the courthouse, and oh, by the way, here it is on Google Earth if you'd like to confirm it. And so all of these people, almost all of them I'd never met before, they all had these individual passions for different things that when it became relevant to the reporting I was doing, they would chime in. So for example, at one point, an Egyptian sent me a photo of this. This was some type of, it looked like some sort of munition. And several Arab language news networks were reporting that Israel was supplying weapons to Gaddafi because there was a six-pointed star right there. Well, you know, that didn't make much sense. And so I tweeted, for argument's sake, let's say Israel sold mortars to Libya. Would they be so dumb as to put a Star of David on them? So my Twitter followers got on the case, and they started looking at databases and military journals and all sorts of things, websites for weapons manufacturer conferences. And they started finding this symbol in a variety of places, and it was manufactured in different ones. So this one, for example, came from India. Someone eventually found this schematic with a six-pointed star on it, which was particularly interesting because it was from 1914. 40 plus years before Israel even existed. And eventually, one of my Twitter followers found a recently declassified NATO manual that if you turn to like page 227 or something, it had all of the specifics on what types of symbols you put, not on weapons, but on star shells, illumination rounds that you shoot up in the air to light up the sky. And it turns out you use a six-pointed star. So despite the fact what Al Jazeera and other news networks were reporting, Israel in this case had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was just a complete misinformation campaign. Let's fast forward a couple months to Syria. It's easy to forget that when this conflict began, it was peaceful in Syria. For months and months and months, people went out in the streets. They were attacked by the government, but they kept marching peacefully. And it didn't really become a civil war until a number of months later. While all this was going on at the beginning, there was a lot of coverage of a young woman living in Damascus, a Syrian American who went by the name Gay Girl in Damascus, who was not tweeting, she was blogging about what was going on in the city and what it was like there. And she became a media darling. All sorts of news organizations were interviewing her. And then one day, we saw the news that she had been kidnapped. And a relative of hers had posted on her blog that she had been picked up by secret police and no one had seen her since. So naturally, the internet mobilized. People started creating campaigns to support her release. This picture appeared all over Twitter. People were using it as an avatar. They were using it on Facebook. People organized protests in front of their local Syrian embassies. I mean, this became a really big deal. So I wanted to learn more about her, and I started asking around if anyone knew her. And I happen to have a contact in Syria who is active in the gay and lesbian community in Damascus. And he's given me permission to share this. What he wrote to me was he'd been talking to people in that community all day, and they hadn't found anyone who actually knew her in person, which seemed rather strange. So I tweeted again, did anyone know her in person? Did anyone know someone else who knew her in person? And we kept looking around, and every person who claimed to somehow know her actually didn't. They were acquaintances, but they had never met in person. And it all started adding up in a real strange way. This photo began circulating all over the place, identifying this as Amina Araf. Well, as it turned out, a few days later, the Wall Street Journal discovered that her name was Jelena Lecic, and she was a Serbian woman living in London, and someone had stolen her Facebook photos and used it on Amina Araf's site. And so we began digging deeper and deeper, talking through contacts on Twitter and Facebook, tracking IP addresses, piecing together their photo galleries that she had posted over the years. And we discovered she was a he. Gay Girl in Damascus did not exist. It was an American named Tom McMasters studying in Scotland who created this character 6 years earlier as a way to talk about the Palestinian conflict with friends online. Eventually, the character morphed from being straight to gay, and all sorts of other interesting issues happened, and he became immersed in this. And so for an entire week, people mobilized around the world to save Gay Girl in Damascus, even though Gay Girl in Damascus was actually Big American Guy in Edinburgh. So, after a few months, when things started to die down, there was a lull in Egypt for several months where you could go to Tahrir Square and meet with the protesters, and not much was going on. So I happened to be going to the journalism training session near Cairo then, so I decided to visit Tahrir Square, and some of the revolutionaries there organized essentially like a meet and greet for me. They all got together at a rooftop cafe that night, and as we were sitting there talking about all things revolution, we started hearing this pop, 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 pop in the distance. And quickly, everyone pulled out their phones and looked at it. And within 5 minutes, almost everyone had left, about 40 people, because they immediately recognized that these were tear gas canisters going off in Tahrir Square. So I decided to tweet out and let people know, famous last words, I hear tear gas being fired in Tahrir. Gonna check it out. Now you have to understand, I've never done reporting in the field before. I mean, basically I was a producer and editor at NPR who happened to be in Egypt, who happened to be using social media for a lot of this. But a few of the protesters said, don't worry, we'll go with you, we'll make sure that you don't get yourself killed. And so we ended up weaving our way to Tahrir Square through the tear gas, through the smoke, until we got to about a block away from Tahrir. And we suddenly realized that we had done a very dumb thing. Because in front of us was a row of police facing the other way, and there were rocks flying over them and Molotov cocktails flying over them towards us. So we were actually behind that particular police line. We then turned around, and there were 50 more police back there, and they were getting their riot gear on. So we realized that we were basically at a police setup point for them to go into battle. So we had to stand there for like idiots for 30 minutes, make sure that we didn't draw too much attention to ourselves. You know, I managed to send out a few tweets and talk to some of the people around there. But it was interesting because, you know, for me, it was an amazing moment. You know, I could see what was happening around me. I could hear it. I could taste it. I mean, literally, you could taste the tear gas as well as smelling it. And I had no idea what the hell was going on. I was completely confused. The fog of war had taken over because I couldn't tell behind that police line whether there were 50 protesters, 500 protesters, or 5,000 protesters. And it wasn't until we were able to sneak out of there, get into a car, and check Twitter that we found out that it was 5,000 protesters. The fighting went on all night and over 1,000 people were injured. And this was a real lesson for me because it was, you know, I was the advocate for social media and journalism, and it had given me a feel for what reporters in the field have to do and what their limitations and what their options are. It made me realize that while I'm able to have this quote-unquote situational awareness from afar, our reporters on the ground are able to look people in the eye. They get the tear gas in the face. They get to run away when the police chase them with clubs. And those are all types of reporting that we can never do away with. And so, despite what you may hear from some people who say, with the advent of social media, we don't need to have journalists going out in the field anymore. We don't need people having foreign desks in different parts of the world. I think, if anything, we've learned something completely different, is that the power of the people can come together online and help us help us figure out with the people who are on the ground the best ways to tell the stories. That they don't conflict with each other, they're actually complementary to each other. And now we just need to figure out how this can work for journalism into the future. Thank you.